I kind of like that intro. Ben, you did a very good job of that intro. Hey, everyone. My name's Caswell Cooke, and welcome to the Caswell Cooke Show. If you're tuning in tonight, we don't know where you're listening or watching from, so please type it in the comments below. We are broadcasting on many different Facebook pages and YouTube and all different places. So, and you might be catching this as a replay. Who knows? But we've had some great interviews this past year or so. We've actually had the show back on the air for what? Since over a year now. Our first guest last year was Billy Gilman, and then COVID happened, and we just started going with 4 or 5 guests a week. It was great, and then we slowed it back down. So now we do the show a couple times a month when we have somebody very important or special to speak to, or they could be special and important. And tonight is no exception. Tonight, I'm going to bring him out in a second. We have Joseph Jacoby, and this is his most recent book. It's called Guilt and Consequences. And believe it or not, he has written and directed 5 motion pictures. So without further ado, let's bring Joe on the screen, Ben.
Hi, Cass.
How are you, Joe? So this is this your first StreamYard interview?
It is, actually. Yeah.
You look like you've done it before. Your backdrop is perfect. It's you've got the book cover right behind you.
Right. Well, that's live television. I got that when I was 19.
So you have such a great story, and I want to thank you for sending me a copy of your latest book, and of course a copy of Boy on a String. You are that boy on the string, right?
Right.
That's right. So let's go back. So I mean, there's a lot of great things I want to touch on, but I kind of wanted to go back to the beginning for you. You were 7 years old, I think, when you decided that you wanted to write. You wanted to do films. Is that about the age?
I was actually, first of all, I never thought I could write. The suggestion was made to me when I was 12. And my teacher, Mrs. Williams, a black woman, a lovely woman, was looking over my shoulder in class. And she said, "Joseph, did you ever think of becoming a writer?" And I thought, oh, that means go hide in a closet somewhere where nobody sees you. And it's hot and the sun is shining through the window. And you've got this white sheet of paper and a typewriter. And I couldn't think of a bigger torture than that. So I never really wanted to be a writer. That happened many, many years later. But I began, I would say, to answer your question, I must have been about 5 years old when my mother would take me to the movies. And that was a world I wanted to be in.
And so for those who don't know your story, tell us about your childhood that formed you into what you are today, and some of those struggles that you went through that you obviously talk about in your book.
Not in the book you showed, but
in Boy on a String.
Boy on a String. Well, I grew up in 7 foster homes in Brooklyn, and 2 institutions between those homes. So there were 9 places from the time I was 7 until I was 18. And all I had really, in terms of continuity, was television. Because no matter where I lived, the characters on television were always there. So had you been there, Caswell, I would have grown up as your best friend, But my friends became puppets. And when I was growing up in the 50s, there were 2 major puppet shows. One was called Lucky Pup, which had basically 2 characters, Houdini the magician and Pinhead, his assistant. And the other show was really more of a variety show. It was Bill Baird's Marionettes, Snarky Parker. And when I was editing the book, or I should say when Walt Bodie, my editor, was editing my book, he was kind of amazed. And he said to me, "Let me ask you something. You became a professional puppeteer, right?" "Right." "You worked for Maury Bunnan and you worked for Bill Baird." I said, "Yeah, it's just the way I wrote it, Walt. There's not a false note in the book." "And you never wanted to do that as a profession?" "No, I fell into it. I needed a job." And it was the only thing I really had an affinity or a love for. And I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what sustained me from the time I was 7, when my mother was institutionalized, until I was about 18.
And so how old were you when you started working with puppets?
Professionally, I was 19. You want to hear the story on that one?
I do. I've never interviewed a puppeteer.
Okay. I was holding cue cards. I was a cue card boy for Merv Griffin. And in those days, we're talking early 60s, television was live in black and white. And the guys who programmed it, the guys who bought the programs, were nervous Nellies. They're still nervous Nellies. But then forget about it. And how this 19-year-old kid got to stand on a stage on live network television with 3 and sometimes 4 cameras, literally holding the cards, the show in his hands, I'll never know. There was some invisible shield that protected me. And I didn't think about that then, but I've reflected back on it in the writing. And I said, how the hell did that happen? That I was allowed, how did I get there in the first place? And once I got there, nobody kicked me out. Nobody said, what's the kid doing up there? So one day during rehearsal, during rehearsal of a game show, the game show was called Keep Talking. And it starred Merv Griffin. There was a sound effects guy, and he looked like a sound effects guy. Big burly guy with a handlebar mustache. And his name was Bob Prescott. And he came up to me and he said, listen, you're a young guy and you know what the kids like. And ABC is interested in this 30-minute news show that we're going to do. But they don't think the kids are going to want to sit through 30 minutes of news. So we're figuring we'll do 15 minutes of news and 15 minutes of something we don't know what. You have any ideas? And I said, for kids, huh? Yeah. Well, how about the Bun and Puppets? Do you know them? This is important. Yeah, I know them. Do you think they'd be interested? I don't know. I'll call. So I went home. In those days, we had phone books. Remember phone books?
I do.
And I looked up Bun and Puppets, 210 Fifth Avenue, and I made a call, and Mr. Bunnan picked up the call. Now, I'm going to stop right here because that was the first sign of a producer in the making. He asked me if I knew them. Of course I knew them. I watched them when I was a kid.
But he meant, did you know them?
Of course. He didn't ask me, do they know you? I'm being honest, but it worked. And I called and Bunnan answered the phone and I made an appointment to go see him. And what was coming next was the closest thing to a religious experience that I've ever had. The door was open and it was a full floor on the 4th floor. The shop was here and the office was there. And I could hear somebody on the phone. And I walked into the archway of the open door and there was a man, a bald-headed man, a very well-built guy with his white sleeves rolled up and you could see the muscles on his forearms, glasses with a piece of tape around the glass. And he said on the phone, somebody's here, I'll have to call you later. And he hung up. While that was going on, I looked over to the wall on the left and there was this wooden cabinet. I write about this in the book. And this is the religious experience. And two glass doors. I get emotional just thinking about it. And inside that cabinet were all the characters that I watched when I was a child on television.
Wow.
My friends were hanging in that cabinet, but they were in color. They're not supposed to be in color. I saw them in black and white. There was no color television. They should have been in their natural black and white. I was a little pissed off about the fact that they were in color. That's why. And Maury hung up the phone, and he was a man then in his 50s. And I'm sure he understood. I was mesmerized, and I really, it was like a tabernacle. And he understood instantly where I was. And he went over to the glass cabinet, and he opened it, and he called me over. And he took Houdini, the magician, that was him, and he put him under his arm. And then he took out Pinhead, the magician's assistant, and he said, here, put him on. And I was fearful of this is like what is it? I can't explain it. It's not, you don't get that close to the shrine. But I put him on, and that was the beginning of a relationship that ran for about 6 years. And his family became almost like they were like an adopted family to me. And he was my mentor. And whatever I knew about puppetry, he taught me. And when I wasn't going to NYU or with the summer, I would work with him at the state fairs, going around the country, just for, he had to make a living, and I was just making. I didn't care. I could pay my rent. That was enough for me. So that's how I began.
That's a great story. Now, speaking of NYU, is that where you met your friend Martin Scorsese?
Yeah, sure.
So how did that happen? I mean, and the reason I bring him up obviously is because he has written. He wrote. Did he write the foreword to Boy with Strength?
He wrote the introduction.
Yeah. He wrote the introduction. So tell us how that relationship started, and how you've watched him take off too.
What do you mean two? He's the only one I know that's reached the moon and back. We were just instant friends. There's no accounting for it. We ran into each other. I was thinking about this earlier today because I thought you might raise it. We were both in the TMR department. That stood for television, motion pictures, and radio. And Marty was focused exclusively on film. But he was living at home on Elizabeth Street, so he didn't have any rent. He was poor, but he didn't have any, lower middle class. I mean, they were not wealthy people, but they were working class people. And I had to pay rent. I was paying $100 a month rent, So I had to make money, and I couldn't make money except television was a way to make some money. So I was focused on television. But we were in the South Building, I think, one day at NYU down in Washington Square. And he was coming one way and I was going the other way. And my earliest recollection is we just connected in the hall. There was something, there's no accounting for it. In fact, if you read his introduction, even he can't quite account for it. As he says in the introduction, some things can be left unspoken. They just happen. They just happen, and you accept there was some magical thing between us. And we both had a love for movies, of course. He was more focused solely on movies. And we both had the same great advisor, Haig P. Manoogian, who was the greatest film teacher you'd ever want. It was just a wonderful time to be learning in the 60s, especially film at NYU. NYU was really the first college in the country that took the art form seriously. And I mean, it was like taking basket weaving, but it wasn't, And
so tell us then how you started, and I read this about one of your pieces, one of your films that's been memorialized. But how do you start working on a low budget film in the 70s? What's the first thing you do? I mean, you have to find the equipment. I mean, how hard is it to start a film from scratch back then?
Well, it's an interesting story. It was the 60s, actually.
60s.
The first feature film I shot in 68. And I began, the process really began probably, I would guess, sometime in late 66 or early 67. I was looking for a job. And in those days, we had the New York Times with want ads,
This seems like a theme in your life, looking for a job.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I'm not sure if I was looking for it or it was looking to find me. That's Jung. That's Jung. Was it all accidental or was it synchronicity? And I think the older I've gotten, the more I believe these things are not accidental, because there's too much consistency. There's too much so-called coincidence, which is acausal. And anyone who's interested in what I'm talking about, read Synchronicity, an Acausal Event by Carl Jung. But what happened was I was looking for a job. I looked for production managers in the Sunday Times, and there was a guy who was doing commercials, and he was looking for a production manager. That I knew I had the capacity. I could do that. So I went down to meet his representative, Bob Gordon. And Bob and I began talking, and he was a very nice guy. And he said, after about 10 minutes of talking, and the director's name was Dick Richards, and he was a really successful commercial director. And Bob said, I just have a gut feeling that you and Dick wouldn't hit it off. You're a little too strong for him. Or I don't know what word he used, but I just don't think it would work. But what are you doing? What are you working on anything? And I said, yeah, as a matter of fact, I'm working on making a movie, my first movie. Well, tell me about that. And I made up a story. I made up a story. And I had a general idea of what kind of film it would be. It would be what was known as an exploitation movie. It would be a 42nd Street movie. This is 1960s, late 60s. And he said, how much money do you need? And I said, well, the budget is $29,000. Have you raised any of the money so far? And I hadn't. I said, I've raised $5,000. Well, I might be interested in putting up $5,000. Oh. And then he said, but I have a friend, and his friend's name was Tony LaRussa, who was an art director at an ad agency. He said, can you come back like on Tuesday and meet my friend Tony? Because he might put up $5,000. Meanwhile, I was in an Army Reserve unit because I had been in the Army. And on Wednesday, in a medical unit. And on Wednesday nights for 4 hours, we would meet. And you know, all the captains in the unit, all the officers were doctors, and they made money in those days, a lot of money. And so I began announcing that I was making this movie. It just took on this momentum. To make a very long story short, I raised $34,500 in about 6 months, and I didn't have a script.
Wow. Did you have a title?
No. Although I will say one thing about titles, and Danny DeVito will vouch for this. If he has anything good to say about me, he'll say, oh man, guy's great with titles. And I came up with the title later, Shame, Shame, Everybody Knows Her Name. It's a great title. And I've been doing this, Hurry Up or I'll Be 30. Or Remember Those Poker Playing Monkeys, which Warner Brothers changed to another title. But, I've had facility for these titles. But the truth is, a friend of mine who was a fashion photographer, his name was Ray Jacobs. He was then in his 40s and I was 27. He had made a feature film called Aroused. It was an exploitation film, and I'd seen it. And I had asked Ray, this is before I even began raising the money, what the picture cost. And he said $29,000. And so I got it in my head, oh, that's what I got to do. I got to raise $29,000. So by the time I raised 34.5, I was at the chemical bank. I look at the bank book. I said, my God, I'm $5,500 over the budget. I've raised 34.5. All I needed was 29. So I had to stop raising the money. And that was the beginning of shooting the film, of making it.
And how long did it take? And so so today it's like, so many people can do things with film. I mean, look at us right now. I mean, I'm doing this with you on a cell phone.
Right.
But you had
Rodriguez. By the way, Rodriguez, the feature film, was shot on an iPhone. Yeah.
But at that time, so you had to film it on what? 8mm film?
Oh no, 35.
And then you went into you had to find an editing studio. Like you had to sit there and cut. I mean, did you do that process?
No. I found an editor. His name is Kemper Peacock, and Kemper was a professional editor. And if you Google him, you'll see the other feature films that he did. And he had his editing room on Broadway and mid-Broadway. And that came later in the day. But I began to put people together piece by piece. Once I had the money, the first thing I had to do was get a script. I got to tell you the story. I had this wonderful attorney, Jack Perlman. I mean, this whole thing sounds crazy. But, you can't make this stuff up. So Jack was somebody who Mrs. Bunn and Charlotte, Maury's wife, she knew Jack because he was also a theatrical attorney, and she was going to do a Broadway show. And she introduced me to Jack, and Jack represented Charlotte Moorman, who was the bare-chested cello player, and the Adolphus Mikas and Jonas Mikas, these avant-garde filmmakers. Jack was into the avant-garde, and he was an independent practitioner. And he sees this 27-year-old, I was then 26-year-old kid walk in. I needed a limited partnership agreement because this thing had to be drawn up and be made legal. And he did it. I said, I can't pay you now. Don't worry about it. You'll pay me when you've got it. And he began, so I had this agreement. And then when I was getting back to Bob Gordon, when I was going to meet Tony LaRussa, I asked Jack if he would come with me because he would give me credence. He would give me, I have a lawyer there. So he said, sure. I said, just add it to the bill. Don't worry about it. So we're on the bus one day. And I said, Jack, I really appreciate your coming with me to these meetings. Are you kidding? I love coming to these meetings with you. You never tell the same story twice. And that was the truth. I've been making up, like if I'm talking to a guy in the unit and, like Captain Feldman, He says, so what's the story about? And I say 2 or 3 sentences. And he says, oh, so then what happens to the girl, the so-and-so, so-and-so? And I say, it's exactly right. And then I continue his idea. So I'm building a story around his story that he's creating. And that's how I got the checks. But then I really had to deal with reality. I got the money, and I had a friend who had a theater up, Maya Eolis. She owned the Kennebunkport Theater, a theatrical theater up in Kennebunkport, Maine, and she knew a lot of writers. And I had written a 3 or 4 page story. I knew the story because you could tell I could always make up a story, right? But I didn't consider myself, even then, a writer. So I hired this guy who, he must have been 80 at the time, I don't know, but he had never written a film. And I gave him these 4 or 5 pages, and I hadn't read anything he'd written, but my vouch for him. And he read the pages in front of me. He said, this is interesting. I said, would you like to do it? And he said, sure. I said, how long would it take? He said, 2 weeks. Would you do it for $500? Sure. 2 weeks later, I got the script. I read the script. I got very depressed. I went to bed. I swear, I threw it on the floor. I dropped it on the floor, and I took a nap because that was the reality. Now, meanwhile, while he was writing the script, I was casting a movie because I knew the characters. So all these things were happening, sandwiching together and building and building. Finally, I ended up with that script, and I made some changes, minor, and we ended up shooting Shame, Shame, and I shot it in 10 days.
And so back then, where do you release a film like that? I mean, where do you have your premiere? And
well, all of this was like, this was not pre-thought out. I mean, all of
right.
this, I'm following something. I don't know what it is, but in those days, you had what was known as stage writers. In other words, there were distributors in New York, but they weren't studios, obviously. They were individuals that had companies, and they had associates all over the country that would sub-distribute their product in their markets.
Right.
So I found the first guy I went to was a guy named Joseph Brenner Associates. Now, I'm very impressionable. I'm 27 years old, and he's associates, Joseph Brenner Associates, and he's on 42nd Street. And he screens the film. Everybody loved the film, by the way. Everybody saw the value for what it was. And it was well made. It's a well-made film, but it's not my kind of film. So Joe Brenner dips into his pocket and he says, I'll put up the advertising, like the money's in his pocket. And I said, what kind of advance? There'd be no advance. And I'll give you a net deal. Oh, I didn't know a net deal from a gross deal. So I'm learning this as I go along. But instinctively, I didn't trust him. I just didn't trust him. He may be 99 years old now. I don't know. I don't need to badmouth him. I just didn't trust him. And Marty and I were talking at that time. He was finishing a film. And that's important to know because I'm going to come back to that. So then I met another fellow. His name was Jerry Balsam. And he had a company called JER Pictures. And he was in the same building as Actors Equity. And I liked Jerry. And I knew I have to do a deal with one of these characters. I did the deal with Jerry, and he gave me a fair deal. And he had his relationship with Bingo Brandt. I don't know if you remember in New York City, there were the Brandt theaters in the 70s. And the Rialto on 42nd and Broadway, which was the crossroads of the world, really. The Rialto had been a theatrical theater in vaudeville, I think, and had been converted to a movie theater. And that was like in the exploitation business, that was like the Radio City. That was like the place you want to be. And I said to Jerry, can you get me the Rialto? He said, I don't know, I'll speak to Bingo. It turned out I got the Rialto too, which was the new sister theater right around the corner. And it was the newest theater on 42nd Street. And the film opened, I think it was August 1970. And it was pretty successful. And the reviews were great.
That's awesome. That's a great story. Now, I want to add 2 questions. First, you mentioned Danny DeVito, and I was going to get there. So you directed him in his first feature. Am I getting this right?
Yes, it was the first feature film he shot. But let me explain this. We shot Hurry Up or I'll Be 30 in 1971. It did not open. The deal was not done until, it didn't open in New York until November 73. in the 2-year interim after he shot Hurry Up or I'll Be 30, and he didn't star, by the way, he's a featured player. He had shot 2 or 3 other films, major films, that opened ahead. I think one of them opened, he did a film for Kirk Douglas that opened ahead of my film. So
wasn't he roommates with Michael Douglas?
they were they still are the best of friends. The best of friends. They met each other in Summerstock. Yeah. He did Romancing the Stone.
Yep.
With Michael. Yeah. And so I can't, it's not, I had nothing to do with discovering Danny DeVito. I just got lucky one night. That's in the book. You read that chapter in the book. I'm walking down Broadway 11 o'clock at night on a cold winter night, and I'm going to get the New York Times, and this little guy's coming up from the other side of the block, and I'm stunned. Don't ask me why, but that's Petey. You know, I knew my characters. This is the second film which I did write. I co-wrote. And as he's getting closer and closer, I said, that's my Petey. And so I don't mean to divert. Am I diverting?
No.
So he's getting closer and closer, and the way he's walking is like balletic, acrobatic, the energy. I mean, it was like exactly the character I had in mind. Of course, he's not an actor. What are the odds of that? Didn't matter. He's still going to get the part, you know. So he walks right past me, and I said, excuse me, sir, excuse me. And he turns around. Do you mind if I ask what you do? Huh? What kind of work do you do? Who are you? I'm a filmmaker. Yeah, I'm an actor. So he figures I'm bullshitting him. He's going to bullshit me back. And I said, are you really an actor? Yeah, I'm really an actor. Are you really a filmmaker? Yeah. What films have you made? Well, I made one right now, and I kind of skimmed over. Right now, I'm doing kind of a slice of life, a comedy. Yeah. Would I know anything you've been in? I'm being polite now, because everybody in New York is an actor if they have an 8x10 glossy and a resume stapled behind it, right? So I'm just being polite. Would I know anything you're in? Yeah. I'm in Cuckoo's Nest off Broadway. Oh, that's Ken Kesey's play. One Flew Over the. Yeah. You know, I really did want to see that. Yeah, you should come see that. Yeah, I'll get you tickets. No, I'll buy that. No, it's okay. So I went the next night, and I went to see One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I don't know how to express this, but I'd never seen anything like this. He didn't have one stitch of dialogue, I don't think. In the movie, too, he doesn't say anything, right? You've seen the movie, Nicholson.
I have.
Okay. And William Devane played the Nicholson part. I think his name is McMurtry. And I'm looking for DeVito. When's he coming on? And there are 2 double doors on the stage, like a waiter's doors. And the waiters come through these 2 doors, swinging doors. All of a sudden, bam! This guy in a white coat, or not a white dress, like an inmate, right? Like a mental hospital. I don't think he had any shoes, barefooted. Bam! The door slams open. He goes from stage left to stage right. Bam! He goes through the next set of doors, and the house comes down. He hasn't said one word. But it's hysteria. The house just comes right down. Then you forget about him. And you're watching the play, and bam, 5 minutes later, he comes out of those doors and heads for and again the house comes down. And I'm looking at this, and I'm saying, who does this? It's all his movements. It's just something about the balletic movements. And it reminded me of Chaplin. It just reminded me of Chaplin. And we went to a little place after the show in the Village called The Bagel for some coffee. And later, Danny would always kid me, you and your coffee. And that night, he had met Rhea, I think about 3 months before I met him. I met him, it would have been the early part of 71. I think he met Rhea the end of 1970, but I'm not sure. But it's in that area. And we sat on a corner table, and I had the script with me for Hurry Up or I'll Be 30. And I told him what I thought of his work, and I gave him the script, and I'd like you to read it, Danny. I'd like you to do it. Yeah, I'll do it. No, but read it. No, I'll read it, but I'll do it. Okay, but I only got one problem. Huh? I don't have any money. What do you mean you don't have any money? No. Let me put it enough. I have $100,000. I can make the movie. I can pay you like $60 a week, but I can't. No, it's fine. It's fine. Nothing I could do would dissuade him. Nothing I could say would dissuade him. And we made the movie. And I made the movie for about $100,000.
That's amazing. Some great stories. Now, listen, believe it or not, we have already gone a half hour. So
Oh,
we're actually getting towards the end of our time, but I have more questions for you. So tell me about how you got involved with Let's Make a Deal.
oh, that was I went. It was '66 or '67. I went to LA. I was still in my 20s, thinking you get up. I left puppetry. I'd already worked for Bunnan and Baird. I wanted to make movies. Movies are not here. They're out in California. It's before I made the first movie, mind you. This is before Shame Shame. I went out there and my background had been game shows because while I was holding cue cards, I was conjuring up ideas for game shows and I optioned a few, including Dan Enright, who was part of the quiz scandals in the 50s. Dan was 21, Tic Tac Toe. And one of the writers, the chief writer of Let's Make a Deal, Alan Gilbert, found out I was out there through an agent I'd found. And I pitched a game show that I brought with me to a guy named Dean Craig, who was an executive at NBC. And Noel Rubeloff was my agent, and Noel said that was very good. The next morning, Noel calls me and says, well, Dean was very impressed with you. I've got good news and bad news. Well, I already knew the bad news. My name isn't Mark Goodson. I said, well, give me the bad news first. He said, it's not the kind of show they're looking for at the moment. Had it been Mark Goodson or Goodson Totson or some combination of those letters, I would have sold the show. So what's the good news? Well, the good news is that they're looking for a third writer on Let's Make a Deal. They just lost a writer. And Alan Gilbert knows you, and he's the head writer. And he said, oh, Joe's out here? I want him. And I said, wait a minute. I didn't come out here to write a goddamn game show. I want to make movies, but you got to pay the rent.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So I got the job on Let's Make a Deal. But to this day, I don't know what the hell I was writing. I don't know what there was to write. And Bernie Gould, these were two vaudevillians I was literally when I was working with. And Bernie Gould once said, you think Monty gets out there and just makes this stuff up out of his head at the spur of the moment? You don't think it's planned? That was the writing. And it's 40 some odd years later, and they're still winding up this toy, and it's still going strong.
Right.
But I just found it meaningless, and I got fired in a very gentle way. Monty's partner, Stephen Haydes, called me one day and said, "Kid, I'm going to have to let you go." And had he not done that, I'd still be there because I don't know how to quit. And so I had my taste of LA. Really, I was there for 2 months. I had a sense of the atmosphere. I had more than just the experience on the game show. I was past game shows at this point in life, but I had a very strong sense of what Hollywood was, and I didn't want to go back. So it was a valuable experience, and I never did go. I mean, I go back and forth all the time, but I've never really lived there except for that time.
So we're gonna jump through the decades now because we want to get to this book. So tell us about this book. It's got a lot of illustrations in it, and it reads like a movie because you want this to become a movie.
Exactly. Yeah. In fact, I was in the middle of writing it. By the way, Cynthia Osasori did the illustrations. She's a young woman living in Georgia, and there are literally 100 illustrations. And I found her on the web, and she's brilliant. She's in her 20s. She's brilliant. In the middle of writing it, I said to myself, this is like an illustrated movie. And then I thought, well, I could see if I could trademark that. And I got a registered trademark. So an illustrated movie is a registered trademark. And I see a franchise in these stories. And what happened, the genesis of this was a script I'd written years before. And I don't know if you know who Edmund Morris was. He was a biographer. He died recently, but he won the Pulitzer for The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt on Teddy Roosevelt. And I actually optioned the rights, which we couldn't get done. It still hasn't been done. But then Ronald Reagan was president, and Reagan loved the book, and Nancy Reagan, they would tell stories they would read it to each other at night. That's what I heard. And Edmund became the first biographer in American history to have access to a sitting president. And the book he wrote on the Reagans was called Dutch.
Yes.
That was Edmund Morris.
I have that book.
Oh, you have it? Then you know. Yeah. That's another story. But anyway, a long story. But Edmund knew I had finished a screenplay that I called I forget, I had a different title. And he said, could I read it? And I said, it's not your kind of thing, Edmund. I don't think it. No, I really would like to read it. And I felt, he had just won the Pulitzer for Teddy Roosevelt. I just felt this erudite Englishman, I don't think so. It's going to waste his time. He was insistent. So I gave it to him reluctantly. 2 weeks later, I found it. We lived in the same building. I found it at the desk with a note. I have that handwritten to this day. And he said, I don't know why you wouldn't let me read this. I found it thoroughly absorbing. He made a suggestion, which I years later, took his suggestion. And he said, thanks for giving me 2 hours of fun at the Roxy, Edmund. And I read that and I said, it can't be as bad as I thought it was. And I began reading it and I said, no, this really, but you know what? I said to myself, this is a novel. I'm going to write this as a novel. And so I'm using my screenplay, my original screenplay, as the template for the novel, Guilt and Consequences. And as I'm writing it, I get to a point where I put a lot of screen direction into my scripts. Now, most directors don't want to see that. They just want to see the words that the actors are speaking. But being the writer-director, I want to remember what I had in mind visually. And so I tend to put it into the notes. But as I'm working, I realize, how do I transcribe these directions into an image? I'll get an illustrator because I can't draw a straight line. And that led me to find Cynthia. And she said to me, how many illustrations do you need? And I said, I really haven't thought about it, but I guess somewhere between 15 and 24 maybe. And how long would they take? And do you want color? Do you want black and white? I said, this is film noir. I want black and white. And how much? And we made a deal, no argument. And 15 or 24 became 100.
Wow.
It just happened. And it took over a year and a half just for the illustrations. Because she was working I would give her the text, pieces of text, and we would talk about what the sets look like generally, and she would give me 3 or 4 sketches. I would pick a sketch, and she would, after a while, she just intuited. I could say 3 words, and she'd say, I got it. And brilliant. So then that was the way I overcame the hurdle of taking a screen direction on a page and turning it into an image. And I feel that when you read the book, it's an amalgam of words and images. And I hope what the reader gets from it is an experience that's more than just reading words. It's sort of seeing the scenes that I'm painting because there they are. If that makes any sense.
It does. So the last thing I wanted to touch on was Alibaba's musical storybook. So tell me about. I listened to some of that yesterday because we were talking earlier today. But tell us first of all, tell us how people can find all of your works, your website or Amazon or.
Well, you can go to Amazon and find everything we've spoken about. Number one, you can also find both books. Ingram is the distributor; they're huge. You can find the books on Barnes and Noble, Sam's Club, Walmart. eBay's got them. They're all over. But Amazon is obviously, they have it as well. Both books. They have them as Kindles, paperback, and hardback. But I would say to somebody who wants to buy the book, either book, Boy on a String or Guilt and Consequences, go around and check various sites because I've noticed there are various prices. You can do, Amazon may or may not be the best price. I don't know. But look at eBay, look at Walmart, check it out. Does that answer that, or was there another?
That answers that, yeah. But and what's your website?
Oh, yeah. By the way, this is important. Boy on a String is an Audible. It's now an Audible on audible.com. It's also on iTunes. And I recorded it. I did the narration, and it came in about 14 hours. So it's a long book to listen to. But people like to listen to. That's how they read these days. Now, Alibaba is also an Audible. Alibaba's musical storybook, and it's a CD on Amazon. So does that answer it? I mean, you can get both books on all those websites.
It is, and so now tell us what Alibaba's about.
Well, Alibaba comes from the 10th century, really. It's a generic story about love and the meaning of life and the value of what our Are we valuable because of how much money we have? Or are we valuable because of our internal riches? I mean, it may sound trite here in 2000 and where are we at?
21.
21. I really drew a blank. You know, it may sound trite, but I think I don't think it's trite. I think it's a very meaningful. It's not necessary for children only. It's a family piece. Now, let me tell you how it came to exist. How much time do we have? An hour?
Keep going. Keep going.
Let me tell you, after I finished Davy Jones' Locker with the Bill Baird Marionettes, we did that. It's a musical as well, and that's also available on Amazon. It's a DVD. We immediately went into, Phil Marshall did the music, Mark Turnbull, the lyricist, and we immediately went into doing Alibaba. And the music and the soundtrack comes first. Because what you do when you're doing this kind of a film, it's like CGI or animation, you have to do the soundtrack first. And the animators work to what they're hearing. So it's called a playback track. As the puppeteers are working or as the animators are working, they're listening on big speakers in the shooting stage to what the words are, so they can animate the puppet or animate the character to what they're hearing. So I had this magnificent 1 hour, 90-minute soundtrack with extraordinary acting, extraordinary music, Phil Marshall, Mark Turnbull's lyrics. I mean, this is like, I'm not exaggerating, Broadway quality. You could see this as a live show on Broadway. And we never got to make the film. And so I had not yet. So I had we were eclipsed, by the way, by Toy Story. But Toy Story eclipsed everything, including animation, including cell animation. And I said to Peter Baird, it opened the same week we opened in California for Academy Award qualification. Right across the street, there was Toy Story, and Peter and I went to see it. And after it was over, I looked at Peter. I said, Peter Baird, I said, what'd you think? Oh, it's great. He was like a big kid, you know. And I said, a four-letter word. It was worse than screwed. We're screwed. And he said, what do you mean? I said, don't you get it? This is a revolution. This was CG. And I said, there'll be pink slips at Disney in 30 days. So my timing on Davy Jones was off. Even though it's traditional entertainment and anybody seeing it loves it. The reviews have been extraordinary. It's won all kinds of awards. But then I said, so we're going to hold off on Alibaba, even though the soundtrack was now done. But recently, I thought, well, you know, I can do this with stop motion, the way Tim Burton did Corpse Bride, or Mars Attacks, or The Nightmare Before Christmas. And he did it at a great place about 30 miles outside of London, Buchanan and Saunders. And I met those guys. I had a retrospective MoMA in New York, and Tim Burton had one right after me. And so John Magliosi, the curator, introduced me to one of the guys from London. And I said, I can take the Baird characters, because puppets are really, they're dolls on strings. And I can fabricate those as stop motion characters. So basically, we've got about 100 stop motion characters once they're fabricated for stop motion. Stop motion, those characters are puppets, but they don't look like puppets. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's been reborn.
Well, that's great. Hey, listen, Joe, I want to thank you for taking time tonight to talk to us. And it's cool that technology allows us to have this interview. And I want to remind people once again about this book, Guilt and Consequences. And I want to thank you for all your stories. We got to have you back again because I love your stories, and we could probably go on for another hour, but we're at the end of our time. But
thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. I hope everybody goes to your website, checks out all your stuff.
The website is josephjacoby.com. There it is.
Right. There you go. Thank you, Ben, for putting that up on the screen. Joe, thank you so much, and have a good night.
You too. Thanks.
See ya. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that was great. I love the stories. And by the way, his impression of Danny DeVito is just like spot on, because everyone knows what Danny DeVito sounds like. I got to meet Danny DeVito at an airport once. That's as much as I got. This guy knew him. Knows him. Anyway, it was great talking to Joe tonight, and I really recommend. I got to go find a copy of his first film somehow, because I want to see it now that he talked about it. We are all done for right now. We do have a great actor coming up. Burton Gilliam. Burton was in Blazing Saddles way back. He was in Fletch with Chevy Chase. He was in Back to the Future Part 3. We haven't scheduled the date yet, but check here. And in the next couple of weeks, you will see that interview. We will go live with Burton. All right, that's it for now. My name is Caswell Cooke. Thank you all for watching. Good night, everybody. Good night, Mom.